I stayed up later than I should have that night. The other two had gone to bed hours earlier, leaving me alone on the porch of our small summer house. The air smelled of salt and damp wood, and the faint chill of late June brushed against my skin. The house sat on a narrow stretch of beach, the kind where the sand was still cool from the night air and the waves crept up in slow, rhythmic rolls. I had a blanket draped over my legs, my notebook in my lap, though I wasn't writing. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular. I was just listening to the waves, the creak of the porch, the soft groan of the old house settling under the night. It was quiet, quieter than I expected. Even the distant hum of cars on the main road a mile inland had faded. The ocean's pulse filled the silence, and for a while it was enough. Then I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. A slow, heavy scraping across the sand. At first, I assumed it was a raccoon or some stray dog scavenging near the tide line. I could see the faint glimmer of moonlight on the water, on the wet sand, and the movement was low to the ground, dragging something. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. The silhouette wasn't right. Too tall, hunched over in a way that looked deliberate, too steady to be a raccoon or a dog. It moved toward the water, the dragging sound following every step. Then it disappeared behind the small rise of sand where the dunes met the shoreline. My stomach tightened, and I felt a sudden pressure in my chest, the kind you get when something in the world feels wrong, but you can't put your finger on why. I stayed frozen for a long moment, straining to hear more. Nothing. The waves continued their slow, patient rhythm, the only sound in the night. I thought maybe I'd imagined it, some trick of shadow and imagination amplified by the dark. But then, instinctively, I reached for the railing, gripping it as if it would hold me in place, and scanned the sand. The drag marks were there. Wide, deep grooves in the soft sand, like something heavy had been pulled along the beach. The pattern was deliberate, each groove spaced with a strange, careful rhythm. It was almost human, the width of a shoulder, the curve of an arm, but wrong. Too long, too wide, too deliberate. I tried to convince myself it was a fisher dragging a cooler, someone working late and trying to avoid headlights, but nothing about it fit. The distance between the marks, the way the sand compressed and tore under whatever had moved, it didn't match anything normal I'd seen. My heart was pounding, but I told myself it was just fatigue, the loneliness of the house at night, the imagination running wild in the dark. I didn't move from the porch. I couldn't. Every sound seemed louder, every wave and whisper of wind a signal that something was still out there. I thought about waking my friends, but I knew they'd laugh, and besides, the figure had vanished behind the dune. There was nothing to do but wait. So I sat, tense, listening, watching, waiting. Time stretched and warped. The scraping sound didn't return, but I couldn't shake the image of that silhouette. The hunched shape, the dragging weight, the slow, deliberate movement. I imagined it moving behind the dunes, creeping along the sand in the dark. The ocean smelled stronger now, damp and briny, almost suffocating in its presence. I could hear the wind shifting through the grasses atop the dunes, and it sounded like whispers, faint voices carried over the water. I tried to focus on anything else. The porch boards creaked under my weight. The distant lights from the inland road flickered across the horizon. The tide came in and lapped against the wet sand. But every time I blinked, I saw it again. The hunched figure standing near the waterline, backlit by the moon, long arms dangling, dragging something I couldn't see clearly. I shook my head, trying to banish it, trying to remind myself that people were rational, that the world wasn't full of shadows that walked alone in the night. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in the porch chair until the first hints of dawn, until the sky lightened to gray and the stars disappeared. I watched as the tide shifted, pulling shells and debris in slow arcs, and finally gathered the courage to walk down to the sand. My legs felt stiff and foreign, my hands trembling as I touched the grooves in the beach. They were unmistakable, wide, heavy, human-shaped but wrong. The drag marks began near the dunes and ended just at the water's edge, where the sand had been flattened and smoothed by the tide. Nothing else in the sand, no footprints leading away, no signs of life, just these long, deliberate scratches. When my friends woke, I showed them the marks. They squinted, laughed, said I'd probably just imagined something, a person dragging a log, a prank, something normal. But I knew what I had seen, and the marks confirmed it. There was no ordinary explanation for the height, the width, the curvature, the way the sand was disturbed. I tried to push it out of my mind as we packed up later, the house creaking behind us, the beach quiet once more under the daylight. I couldn't stop thinking about the silhouette. It had been real, and it had been there. Just one person, maybe more, moving carefully in the dark, dragging something across the sand. I went back home with images burned in my mind, replaying the night over and over, imagining what could have been, analyzing the width of the drag marks, the shape of the shadow. I couldn't reconcile it with anything I knew. Weeks later, I returned to that beach during the day. The tide had reshaped the sand, smoothing the marks entirely, leaving no evidence behind. The house looked harmless under sunlight, small and weathered, the dunes gentle and bright. But I knew the truth. I had seen something real that night, something deliberate, human, and unknowable. Something that had moved quietly under the cover of darkness and vanished without a trace, leaving only the sand to remember it. Even now, months later, I think about that stretch of beach. I think about the slow, deliberate scraping across the sand, the hunched figure, the drag marks. It was a human, I tell myself. Maybe a trespasser, someone careless, someone hiding. But the precision, the timing, the way it moved, it was not normal. And every time I close my eyes, I see it again, the silhouette backlit against the moon, dragging something I'll never know, moving across the beach and into memory, leaving only the quiet and the sand behind. I arrived at my parents' apartment just before sunset. The building was quiet, as always, the kind of suburban New Jersey complex where nothing ever happened, and that was exactly why they had trusted me to house sit. The keys felt heavy in my hand, the metal cold against my palm, and I noticed immediately that the apartment smelled faintly of paint and cleaning products. The movers had left some boxes scattered near the entrance, and the floors were bare, smooth wood that reflected the fading light coming through the large living room window. I carried the boxes inside, setting them down carefully, trying to imagine where the furniture would go once everything was arranged. It felt strange to walk through the apartment without the usual clutter of a lived-in home. There were no couches, no chairs, just walls and floors, and it made every sound echo too clearly. My own footsteps sounded unnaturally loud. I started unpacking the boxes methodically, stacking books and kitchenware, trying to convince myself that I was being productive. The quiet of the apartment was comforting at first, but as the sun slipped below the horizon, it became heavy. The air seemed thicker, and the shadowed corners of the rooms grew longer. I was standing near the kitchen when I first heard it, a faint whisper, almost indistinguishable, like someone exhaling just behind my ear. I froze. The apartment was empty, completely empty, but the sound was there again, just a fraction louder, coming from the hallway leading to the bedrooms. It didn't make sense. I moved toward the hallway slowly, heart thumping. The whisper wasn't a word I could understand. It was just a caution, a hiss that made my skin prickle. I checked every room, every closet, the bathroom, even behind the doors. Nothing. I stood in the hallway, straining to hear, but all that reached me now was the sound of my own breathing and the soft creak of the building settling. I told myself it was the pipes, the wind through a slightly open window somewhere, anything but someone else being here. I returned to the living room, trying to shake the feeling, but that's when I noticed it. The breeze. It was subtle at first, a movement of air across my arm that didn't come from the window, the door, or any vent I could locate. I felt it again, stronger this time, and then the unmistakable click of the door leading to the kitchen shutting itself. I turned sharply, my hand gripping the edge of a box for support. The door was closed. I had not touched it. I checked it carefully, testing the latch and hinges. Everything was normal. The breeze had passed, leaving the room unnaturally still, almost oppressive. I tried to continue unpacking, but every sound made me jump. The tap of a box against the floor, the scrape of cardboard as I shifted items inside. My imagination kept filling the apartment with movements that weren't there, shadows stretching in ways that didn't align with the light. I felt my pulse in my ears, a relentless drum that kept me alert to any irregularity. I moved from room to room, checking windows and doors, locking them one by one. The locks clicked solidly, and still, the air felt different, heavier somehow, as if the apartment itself had noticed I was alone. Hours passed. I lost track of time, measuring it only by the fading and returning light outside the windows. I sat on the floor, using one of the boxes as a makeshift pillow, my back against the wall. My knees were drawn up, my hands clasped around them. The apartment was quiet again, but I could not shake the feeling that it had changed. The spaces I had walked through confidently hours before now seemed like unfamiliar corridors, unfamiliar angles where something could hide just out of view. Every creak of the floorboards beneath my feet sounded deliberate, echoing in the bare rooms. I couldn't imagine anyone else being inside, and yet, the sense of being watched persisted. I stayed in that position, eyes focused on the hallway, barely blinking, barely moving, waiting for something I could not name. I considered leaving, but the thought of walking through that same hallway in the dark, alone, made my stomach twist. My phone sat on the kitchen counter, fully charged, but I resisted checking it. Every sound, every whisper in my mind, seemed louder with the glow of the screen, more insistent. I felt trapped, the apartment both a familiar home and an alien space at once. Eventually, exhaustion crept in. My arms ached from holding boxes, my legs were stiff from sitting in one position, and my mind began to blur with the edges of fear and fatigue. I dozed lightly, waking at intervals to check the doors, to reassure myself that I was alone. Each time I opened a door or peered into a shadowed room, I felt the air shift, the quiet grow heavier, as if the apartment was responding to my vigilance. I realized I had been holding my breath without noticing, and each exhale seemed to echo unnaturally, a reminder of my isolation. Morning came finally, pale light filtering through the blinds, soft and ordinary. The apartment was quiet, neutral, just as it should have been. I walked through it slowly, testing doors and windows, touching the floors with my hands. Everything was normal. The boxes were still in the same places. The apartment smelled of faint cleaning products and wood. Nothing had moved. No one had been there. I felt a strange mixture of relief and lingering tension, like stepping out of a nightmare while knowing it had left traces on my skin. I packed my things, careful and deliberate, trying not to rush, trying not to relive the dread that had filled the night. I locked the doors behind me and stepped into the crisp morning air, the sun warm against my face, the neighborhood silent but normal. I did not look back at the apartment. I did not plan to return. House sitting had seemed simple, even boring, but that night had reminded me how fragile a sense of security could be, how easily the ordinary could be shaken by small, inexplicable things. I never returned to that apartment, and I never thought of it without a trace of unease. The memory stayed with me, clear and precise, a quiet reminder of how disorienting it can feel to be completely alone in a place that should have felt like home. The apartment was quiet in a way I had never noticed before, the kind of silence that presses against your ears, making every small sound seem louder than it should be. My roommate had left for the weekend to visit family, and I had stayed behind to finish finals. The city outside never really sleeps, but from the 23rd floor, the noise felt distant, like it belonged to someone else. Street lights made the buildings glow in muted gold and silver, and traffic moved in a steady hum far below. I was sitting on the edge of the couch, laptop balanced on my knees, eyes scanning essay after essay, when the first sound came. It was faint at first, a scratch, a scraping along metal. My stomach sank. I paused, holding my breath, listening. It came again, closer this time, sliding along the fire escape outside the living room window. The window was closed, but I could hear it, clear enough to tell it wasn't wind. I pressed my ear to the glass, convinced I was imagining things. The sound stopped for a moment, then returned, slower now, deliberate, almost patient. I looked around the apartment. Everything was in its place. The blinds were pulled down, the lights off except for the warm glow from my laptop. My phone lay on the coffee table. I considered calling someone, but who would believe it? The building office, maybe. I forced myself to breathe normally, and stayed where I was, straining to hear. The scratching moved, the rhythm changing, going along the side of the building. Each metallic scrape made my heart jump. I finally picked up the phone and dialed the apartment office. The voice on the line was calm, even professional. I explained what I heard. After a moment, they confirmed what I feared. No maintenance staff, no other tenants scheduled to be in the building, no one with access to my floor at that hour. They told me to lock my doors and stay inside. I did. I checked the deadbolt twice, made sure the chain was engaged. Every lock in the apartment felt suddenly insufficient. I sat back down, laptop open but forgotten, listening. The sound returned, closer, lighter, almost gliding along the metal. I could picture it clearly, someone climbing along the fire escape, hand over hand, moving methodically. My chest tightened. I didn't want to make sudden movements. I didn't want to acknowledge it too loudly, for fear that it might hear me. I tried to focus on my work, tried to grade a few papers, but my fingers hovered over the keyboard, unwilling to type. Hours passed. Time felt distorted. I would glance at the clock, see it move forward in small increments, and the sound would return, dragging along the fire escape, sometimes pausing, sometimes shifting in rhythm, as if the person outside was considering their next move. My eyes didn't leave the window for long stretches. The city was dark except for street lights and distant headlights. Occasionally, a pedestrian walked along the sidewalk below, tiny against the street, completely unaware of the tension on the floor above. I didn't dare sleep. I moved the sofa so it was flush against the window, tried to make myself smaller, less visible. I imagined someone peering in, imagined muddy boots leaving marks on the balcony just out of sight. The thought of someone climbing higher, even one floor above, made my stomach churn. I could hear footsteps now, slow, deliberate, moving along the wall beneath me. Not on my balcony, but somewhere close, precise and heavy. Each step sounded like it could have been right outside the door. When I thought about calling the police, I realized I didn't know what I would say. Someone might be outside, maybe not. Maybe it was just the wind or some maintenance from another building. But the scratches, the footsteps, the way the sound shifted, nothing made sense if it wasn't a person. I stayed awake, every muscle tensed, eyes scanning shadows, ears straining for the smallest shift in sound. Eventually, the sky began to lighten. Early morning gray seeped into the city, softening the streetlights, illuminating the buildings more clearly. The sound had stopped completely hours ago, leaving the apartment too quiet again, the kind of quiet that made me tense even more. I didn't move from the couch until the sun was fully up, until the city was awake with traffic and the hum of daily life. Then I looked outside. The balcony floor was wet in patches, the last remnants of snow melting in the sun. And there they were, footprints. Muddy, human fresh. They started at the edge of the railing, curved around in careful steps, and disappeared near the balcony door. The prints were small, enough to belong to a single person, deliberate in placement, as if someone had measured each step. I traced them with my eyes, heart hammering, stomach nodding. I left the apartment immediately. I didn't pack much, just the essentials. Laptop, charger, a few personal items. I called the office again to report the footprints, and they said they would send maintenance up to check, but I didn't wait for them. The thought of staying another night, even with locks and chains, was unbearable. The apartment, which had always felt like a quiet refuge in the city, now felt exposed, unsafe, a place where someone had moved around while I slept. I found a friend's apartment across town, and stayed there for the rest of the week. Finals were hard to focus on, but nothing could compete with the memory of those steps, the metal scraping, the knowledge that someone had been that close without me noticing until it was almost too late. When I finally returned to collect my things, the apartment felt smaller, constricted. Every corner, every shadow seemed suspicious. I moved out permanently the next week. The memory of the footprints stayed with me longer than the fear itself. Muddy, precise, undeniably human. Someone had been there. Someone had climbed, waited, circled, and left. The apartment never felt the same afterward. I realized that safety isn't just about locks or doors. It's about knowing that the space you occupy isn't just yours. I never went back to that building. Every time I think about it, I remember the metal scraping, the footsteps along the wall, and the muddy prints on the balcony that made me leave a home I had once considered mine. I had arrived at the cabin the afternoon before, driving a narrow, winding road that cut through the dense forest of the Blue Ridge Mountains. November in Virginia carried the first hints of winter, the air crisp and sharp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and wet pine. The cabin was small, made of dark wood, with a stone chimney that rose awkwardly against the backdrop of tall, skeletal trees. The owner had described it as isolated, perfect for meditation and reflection. I had come for quiet, for a week alone with nothing but my thoughts and the woods around me. The first evening passed uneventfully. I unpacked my few bags, set a small heater by the corner of the room, and lit a single candle on the rough wooden table. The air inside smelled faintly of smoke and old timber, a comfort after the cold outside. I made a simple dinner of canned soup heated on the stove, then walked to the edge of the small porch to watch the fading light. The mountains stretched in rolling waves, their peaks jagged and soft at the same time under the dim glow of twilight. A few crows called from the treetops, and somewhere in the distance, a creek murmured faintly. I went to bed early, anticipating the meditation and early rising I had planned. I woke before dawn around 5:30. The sky was a dull gray, heavy with cloud, and the trees pressed against the edges of the small clearing like silent guards. At first, I thought the noise was the wind. I heard a scraping, a sharp sound, metal against rock. My heart ticked faster. I rolled onto my side and squinted through the window facing the hillside. The cabin sat on a gentle slope, clearing stretching perhaps 30 feet before the forest began again. At first, I saw nothing. Then movement. A shadow, dark and bulky, sliding across the slope. It moved too fast, too fluidly to be human. Its steps made no sound, no snap of branches, no rustle in the leaves. I blinked, adjusting my eyes to the gray light, trying to convince myself it was a trick of shadows. But the motion repeated, and my stomach tightened. I stayed under the covers, watching for a long while. The figure didn't climb trees, didn't vanish behind rocks. It remained just on the edge of the clearing, pacing in some odd, deliberate way, then disappearing behind a ridge farther down the hill. I forced myself to breathe evenly, telling myself I must have been half asleep, imagining things. But then I noticed the subtle signs. Small stones displaced on the slope, faint streaks in the dirt that suggested something heavy had scraped along them. Nothing about the sound or the movement suggested natural animal behavior. Deer and foxes didn't make metal scraping noises. Raccoons didn't move like that. I stayed in bed, too afraid to move. I didn't want to open the cabin door or step outside, but I also didn't want to retreat entirely under the covers. I sat by the window for hours, the scraping returning at intervals, always on the slope, always just beyond reach. The forest remained quiet otherwise, no wind, no birds, nothing but that deliberate, calculated movement. I tried to rationalize, thinking perhaps someone was hiking in the dark, careless, carrying equipment that caught on rocks. But there was no trail, no path, and no way a person could move that silently and that quickly over the rough slope. Morning arrived slowly. Light filtered weakly through the clouds, thin and gray. I finally forced myself up, dressing quickly in layers, boots and jacket heavy and stiff with cold. The forest around the cabin was still and damp. I stepped onto the porch, scanning the hillside. Nothing moved. The scraping had stopped. I walked down to inspect the slope, stepping carefully on the soft ground. That's when I saw the marks on the cabin door. They were deep, jagged, irregular scratches that ran from the bottom of the door to just above my waist. The wood was splintered in places, as if something heavy and strong had clawed at it. The pattern didn't match any animal I knew. Bears, even with their size, left broader, less precise scratches. The marks were too deep and oddly shaped, angled in ways that suggested deliberate force, almost intelligence. My stomach sank. I walked around the perimeter of the cabin, checking windows and the back door. All seemed intact, but the feeling of being watched lingered, heavy and insistent. I packed quickly, leaving the cabin as clean as I could. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting movement in the trees, in the brush, expecting to see a figure darting silently behind trunks. The forest was still, but the memory of the scraping, the shadow, and the claw marks made every step tense, deliberate. I drove away slowly, eyes scanning the hillsides, imagining shapes in every clearing. I didn't speak of it to anyone. I didn't want to sound paranoid, didn't want to suggest something beyond explanation. But the image stayed with me, the way the shadow moved, the sound it made, the jagged marks on the door. I never returned. Months later, I thought about going back, telling myself it must have been a combination of fatigue, darkness, and imagination. But I couldn't. I couldn't ignore the knowledge that someone or something had been close enough to my cabin to leave evidence of strength, speed, and intent. The isolation that had promised peace had instead delivered anxiety. The mountains, so beautiful in daylight, became a place of acute awareness and memory. I realized how vulnerable a person could feel alone, how easily the mind grasped for rational explanations when instinct screamed otherwise. The forest was quiet again in memory, yet I could hear the scraping, feel the weight of the shadow across the slope, and see the clawed door as clearly as if I had left it minutes ago. I stayed home for weeks after that, sleeping with the lights on, avoiding silence. Eventually, the feeling faded enough to function normally, but the memory never left. The cabin remained rented, likely hosting other seekers of solitude, other meditators, but I couldn't face it. The quiet I had sought had revealed a fragility I wasn't prepared to confront. Even now, years later, I recall the way the early morning fog clung to the forest floor, how the shadow moved over the hillside, and the raw, brutal lines etched into the door. It was not supernatural, not impossible to explain in theory, but it was real. Something had been there, unseen, deliberate, and impossibly fast. I left the Blue Ridge Mountains that morning and never returned. The cabin still exists, quiet and untouched, waiting for the next person to find peace, or something else entirely. I drove the last few miles through the backwoods outside Whitefish, Montana, with the road narrowing to a single lane of compacted snow, trees pressing close on both sides. The headlights barely cut through the thickening winter night, reflecting off ice-crusted branches that hung low over the road. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual, not from fear, but from the cold that seeped into the cabin of my old Subaru, making the heater's hum feel like a faint comfort rather than warmth. The sky was a deep, unbroken black, and the occasional gust of wind rattled the mirrors and hood as if the trees themselves were breathing around me. I kept the thermos of coffee between my legs, taking small sips, letting the bitter liquid give me a false sense of companionship. Hours had passed since leaving the highway, and I could count the other cars I had seen on one hand. None of them had slowed, none had signaled, only distant taillights swallowed by curves and snowbanks. By the time I pulled into the clearing where the cabin sat, it was nearly dark enough that my headlights could do little more than illuminate the front steps. The cabin looked smaller than I had imagined from the photographs online, but sturdier. Logs darkened by age and weather stacked neatly, the roof covered in a thick blanket of snow. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, erratic wisp, the wood stove inside still warm from the previous occupant, or perhaps from my early arrival. I parked and let the car idle while I opened the doors, the scent of pine and cold earth hitting me immediately. I carried my bag inside, the snow crunching underfoot, feeling the crisp winter air bite through my coat. Inside, the cabin was simple but functional. A small kitchen, a living area with a couch and a wood stove, a single bedroom off to the side. I placed my bags on the floor, checked that the stove had fuel, and poured myself another cup of coffee, letting it steam in the cold kitchen as I watched the snow settle on the windows from the inside. I had intended to write for hours tonight, and for a time I did. I sat at the small desk facing a window, tapping on the laptop, surrounded by the low hum of the wood stove and the occasional groan of the cabin settling in the cold. Outside, the wind brushed against the roof and walls, sometimes in sharp, deliberate gusts, sometimes in long, sighing sweeps that rattled the windows. It was soothing in a way, the isolation amplifying my focus. I knew the roads I had come from were nearly deserted, the town hours behind me, and the nearest neighbor who might hear a shout was at least a mile away through snow and forest. That thought alone had kept me feeling secure all evening. Around 10:30 p.m., the first sound came. A light, slow tapping against the window to my left. I froze, my fingers hovering above the keys. At first, I thought it was a branch scraping the glass in the wind. I leaned forward and watched, seeing nothing move outside except the occasional flurry of snow. Then came a grunt, soft and low, from the woods. My heart rate picked up, and I glanced at my phone, searching for signal for something, anything. Dead. No bars. The thought of a stranded traveler, an animal, or someone wandering lost flickered through my mind, and I pulled the blinds tightly across the window. That seemed to calm me at first. Maybe it was nothing, or maybe it was the wind, the trees, the isolation playing tricks on my senses. I returned to my laptop, though my typing slowed, and the words I wrote felt hollow, distant, as if the tapping had rearranged the room around me. 10 minutes passed. 15. Then I heard it again, but this time it was different. Not a tapping against the glass, but footsteps. Soft, deliberate, circling the cabin. The snow outside muffled anything I might have heard if I had been on the porch, but inside, every scrape against the wood, every faint shift of the floorboards seemed amplified. I rose quietly, moving closer to the center of the living area, peering out the small kitchen window toward the darkness beyond. Nothing, just trees, snow, and the way the light from the stove threw shadows across the yard. I listened, and the movement continued, slow, careful, always around the edges, just out of sight. The minutes stretched, thick and unyielding. I moved the couch slightly, placing it in front of the front door, using a small dining chair to reinforce it. My mind raced through possibilities, the ones that made sense and the ones that didn't. This was Montana in the middle of winter. Few people traveled these roads at night. And yet, someone or something was out there, and the simple fact that I could not see it did not make it any less real. I tried to keep my breathing shallow, to listen without making a sound. Every groan of the cabin, every scratch of branches against the siding made my pulse jump. The soft grunt I had heard earlier replayed in my mind, like a warning that the forest was not empty. By 11:30, the steps had circled 3 times. I could feel them through the floor, subtle vibrations against the soles of my shoes, against the thin floorboards of the cabin. My hands were clammy, the coffee long gone, the thermos empty. I crouched in the corner, behind the small stack of firewood I had piled near the stove, thinking about what I would do if the door gave way. The idea of calling the sheriff, of barricading myself in the bedroom, crossed my mind. But the nearest deputy station was over 40 minutes away on snow-covered roads. I was truly alone. All I could do was wait and observe, trying to record every sound, every shadow, every brush of snow against the logs. Midnight came, and the footsteps stopped. The silence was different from the wind-driven quiet I had gotten used to. It felt heavy, patient, deliberate. I stayed crouched in the corner, listening to the cabin's own noises, the settling logs, the crackle of the dying fire, the occasional whistle of wind through the eaves. I forced myself to breathe, to calm the adrenaline pumping through my chest, knowing that once I moved, the safety I had constructed would disappear. I stayed there for another hour, until the first faint light of winter dawn touched the tips of the pine trees. The footsteps did not return. The tapping on the window did not resume. The forest was still. I waited, counting the seconds, until the sun began to rise, painting the snow in a soft pink glow that made the world seem, temporarily, almost safe again. When I finally approached the front door, I found no footprints in the snow leading away, no sign of a person, no tracks at all. Only the circle of crushed snow where I had imagined movement. Nothing tangible, nothing to explain the sounds that had kept me pinned in the corner for hours. I opened the door slowly, the hinges groaning under frost, and stepped onto the cold porch. The morning was clear, and the forest was quiet except for the distant call of a jay or a woodpecker somewhere deep among the trees. I stood there for a long moment, listening, trying to reconcile the terror of the night with the calm of the day. There was no one at all, and yet I knew what I had heard, what I had felt. The wind, the snow, the isolation, it had all conspired to make the night feel alive, to turn the simplest sounds into a threat. I spent the next hour checking the locks, securing the windows, and building the fire back to life. I poured myself coffee, stronger this time, and returned to my desk. The sun, low over the horizon, warmed the cabin enough that I could remove my coat. The silence now was a comfort, a reminder that the night had passed. I wrote that morning, but the words were different, sharper, more aware, more attuned to the world around me. And though the sounds would not return, and though the footsteps were never explained, I understood something essential about being alone in a place like this. Isolation could twist the familiar into the unknown, and sometimes, the mind's fear was just as real as any visitor at the window. The morning carried me through, and by the time the sun reached its peak, I felt in control again, my retreat intact, the cabin finally quiet, truly mine for the first time. I pulled off Route 66 in Arizona around midnight, exhausted from the long stretch of road behind me. The sun had disappeared hours ago, and the highway was lit only by the occasional flickering street lamp and the headlights of distant cars. I was hoping to make it to the next town, but after hours of driving through nothing but desert and scrub, I realized there was nothing ahead for at least 50 miles. The map on my phone showed a small cluster of motels near a side road, and I figured I'd stop and rest, stretch, and grab a shower before continuing. I had been driving for nearly 12 hours straight, and my body was starting to ache in a way that made focusing on the road almost impossible. The motel was the last room available on the stretch I found. The neon sign buzzed faintly, one of the bulbs flickering like it might give out at any moment. The building itself looked old, the paint peeling, the concrete cracked and uneven. The parking lot was empty except for one older pickup truck parked near the far end. I checked in quickly. The clerk was behind a counter cluttered with papers, receipts, and a faint smell of cigarette smoke. He barely looked up at me, just handed me a key with a small card attached. Room 12. I didn't think much of the sparse interaction. I was tired. I wanted the room and nothing more. When I opened the door, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was inside. The room smelled faintly of cleaning supplies and something else I couldn't identify. The carpet was threadbare, the bed spread thin, and the mini fridge in the corner rattled slightly when I touched it. I set my bag down, stretched, and turned on the overhead light. It was harsh and buzzing, the kind of light that made every shadow look sharper, deeper. The air conditioning unit rattled in the window, providing a low, constant hum. I took a shower quickly, letting the hot water wash away the fatigue of the road, then collapsed onto the bed. My eyelids felt heavy, but I was still alert enough to notice the silence. Not an unusual silence for a roadside motel at that hour, but it pressed against me in a way that made me uneasy. I must have drifted off for a few minutes, because the first thing I heard was a knock. It wasn't soft or quick. It was deliberate, heavy, each tap measuring time in a way that made my chest tighten. I sat up immediately, listening. The clock read 2:15 a.m. I froze. The knock came again, 3 slow, heavy raps. I told myself it was probably someone knocking on the wrong door, maybe another guest who got lost, but instinctively I checked the peephole. There was nothing there. The parking lot was empty. The shadows from the flickering sign stretched across the room, and I could see nothing but the cracked asphalt beyond the window. My stomach tightened. My hands shook slightly as I unlatched the deadbolt and cracked the door open. No one. Just the empty hallway, dimly lit and quiet. I stepped back, heart pounding, and closed the door carefully, double-checking the lock. Then I noticed the window. At first, I thought it was condensation or a smudge from cleaning, but as I leaned closer, the shapes became clear. Large handprints, smeared across the inside of the glass. Wet, glistening, warm. I stepped back, certain I had imagined it, but when I reached out, the residue felt tacky under my fingers. My mind raced. No one could have entered the room. The door had been locked from the inside. The hallway had been empty. I didn't hear anyone moving in the motel. Still, the handprints were undeniable. I could see the streaks leading down toward the sill, the edges pressed as if someone had leaned hard against the glass. I grabbed my keys without thinking and ran out the door. The hallway was silent, empty. The stairs creaked under my feet as I ran to the parking lot. I climbed into my car, locked the doors, and sat there for what felt like an hour. The headlights cut through the darkness, the engine ticking as it cooled. Every so often, I thought I saw movement along the edges of the lot, a shadow crossing just outside the beams. I convinced myself it was my imagination, the mind playing tricks when the adrenaline is high and the darkness is complete. Still, I didn't take my eyes off the motel, the windows, the doors, the cracked concrete. Every small sound, the hum of the ASC, the distant highway, the wind rattling a loose piece of metal, made me flinch. I stayed awake, keys in hand, watching, listening, waiting for anything to move. Hours passed. The air cooled as dawn approached, and the shadows of the motel stretched long across the parking lot. I watched the sky lighten slowly, the first hints of orange and pink bleeding into the desert horizon. Eventually, I dared to glance at the window of room 12. The handprints had dried, almost faded in the morning light, but the outlines remained, smeared and dark against the glass. I breathed slowly, trying to calm my racing heart. I thought about calling the police, but the nearest town was miles away, and I wasn't even sure anyone would believe me. The motel clerk was still at the counter when I left, alone in the lobby as if nothing had happened. I didn't mention the handprints or the knocks. I didn't want questions, explanations, or disbelief. I just paid, got in the car, and left. The sun was rising over the desert, and the heat of the day was already building. The road stretched ahead, long and empty, but the motel remained behind me. Its walls, its windows, the room I had stayed in felt like they were still watching. I kept driving, feeling the weight of exhaustion and the residue of fear pressing against my chest. Even hours later, when I stopped at another town for gas, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there, had pressed their hands against the window, had watched me. It wasn't supernatural, I knew that. It didn't need to be. The human element, the unknown intentions, the presence of another person who had gotten too close, too deliberate, was terrifying enough. I never stayed at another roadside motel alone after that. Route 66 stretched on, endless, and I drove it, but I made sure to avoid the empty rooms, the silent halls, the windows that might hold a trace of someone else. That night stayed with me, clear and sharp, a reminder of how small and exposed you can feel when the world is quiet and you are alone. The handprints, now dry and faint, were the only evidence left behind. They didn't move. They didn't speak. But I never forgot them. I was alone in the studio that evening, the city outside already softening into night. The light from the single lamp on my desk cast long shadows across the hardwood floor, and the faint hum of the radiator filled the small space. I had been typing steadily, working on a project that required my full attention, and the quiet was so complete it almost felt unnatural. Somewhere between the clatter of keys and the distant sounds of the city, sirens, a car door slamming, the occasional footstep on the street below, I heard a noise that didn't belong. It was deliberate, metallic, and uneven, the scrape of boots or shoes against the fire escape outside the window. I froze. My hands lingered on the keyboard, fingers suspended mid-strike. The sound didn't continue in a straight rhythm. It moved irregularly, circling. There was a pause, a slide, then the faint shift of weight again. My first instinct was to dismiss it, tell myself it was the wind, or a neighbor, or some random maintenance worker, but the timing didn't match anything I had ever heard. The pacing seemed intentional, measured, as though whoever it was were mapping the outline of the building in real time. I moved closer to the window and leaned over the sill, trying to see through the frosted glass. The thick pattern obscured most of the exterior, but I could make out movement, thin, elongated shapes that weren't consistent with any normal passerby. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the stairwell. I thought my mind was exaggerating, trying to match the fear building in my chest, but then I saw it. A figure, tall and thin, passing slowly across the glass. It moved with a patience that made my stomach twist. Every time I tapped a key, the shadow stopped, as if watching me type, following each small motion. I stepped back, my pulse spiking. My breathing grew shallow. I could feel my legs tensing beneath me, my backpack resting against the chair beside my desk. The air in the room suddenly felt heavier, every sound amplified. The creak of the building, the distant siren, the soft thump of the radiator. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was a maintenance worker, checking the stairs, lost, looking for an exit. That thought did nothing to calm me. The figure's presence was deliberate. It didn't hurry, it didn't fumble, it simply paced. I grabbed my backpack quietly, sliding my feet along the floor to avoid any noise. My movements were slow, cautious. I didn't want to alert whoever, or whatever was outside. I crouched low, keeping my body pressed against the desk and wall, and edged toward the stairwell door. The sound of footsteps continued for a moment longer, then paused, as though the person had sensed my shift in position. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs. The air smelled faintly of dust and old metal, and the cold from the window brushed against my cheek. I waited, barely breathing, until the footsteps moved again, retreating in the same methodical manner, fading into the empty stairwell. I descended slowly, keeping low, gripping the railing, careful not to scrape my backpack against the walls. Every creak of the wooden stairs made me flinch, my ears straining for the slightest echo of movement behind me. When I reached the ground floor, I paused, listening. Nothing. The lobby was empty, the faint smell of old carpet mixed with the antiseptic cleaner from earlier in the day. I edged toward the street door, keeping my hand on the doorknob, and opened it slowly. Cold air rushed in, sharp and clean, and for the first time I realized how tense my body had been. I stepped outside, glancing back at the building. There was no one on the fire escape, no shadow moving against the glass, just the faint glimmer of the streetlights reflecting off wet asphalt from a recent drizzle. I walked quickly toward the corner, backpack slung over one shoulder, listening intently for any sound. The echo of the footsteps in the stairwell haunted me more than any actual presence. For weeks afterward, I could almost hear them again. The irregular pacing, the scraping of shoes against metal, the slow, deliberate stops that felt synchronized with my every move inside the studio. It wasn't a recurring hallucination, not exactly, but the memory of it altered the way I moved through the building. I avoided the window near my desk, kept the door locked even during the day, and never stayed past sunset alone. Eventually, I realized I couldn't ignore what had happened. The building's security had cameras, and I had asked the management to review the footage. A man had been seen entering the stairwell that evening, climbing to my floor, then pausing outside my window before retreating without attempting to enter the apartment. He had been tall and thin, wearing dark clothing, and his movements matched the shadow I had seen. It was a trespasser, someone observing, someone patient enough to wait for an opportunity. The footage confirmed my fears and clarified the reality. What I had felt was real. There were no supernatural forces, no imagined figures, just a person who had chosen to make my studio a point of interest. I changed my routine after that. I installed an extra lock on the window, added motion-sensitive lights outside, and kept my backpack by the door at all times. I learned to move cautiously through the building, always checking the hallway before leaving my apartment, always listening. It didn't take away the memory, but it gave me control, a small sense of agency that I had lacked when I first saw the shadow. Months later, When I finally felt comfortable being alone in the studio again, the memory of that night remained vivid, but it had lost some of its immediate terror. I could walk past the window without freezing, open the door without gripping the handle until my knuckles whitened, and move through the stairwell without expecting someone to appear at any moment. The footsteps no longer haunted me in the same way. They were a warning, a reminder of how quickly normalcy could be disturbed, of how someone could violate your space without a sound or a confrontation. The experience stayed with me because it was entirely believable, entirely human. Fear didn't come from monsters or ghosts. It came from knowing that another person, unpredictable and patient, had observed me, and that I had only narrowly escaped an encounter that could have been dangerous. The studio returned to its quiet, regular rhythm, the lamp casting shadows that were ordinary now, the radiators hum just background noise, the city alive beyond the walls. But I never forgot the figure outside the frosted glass, pacing, circling, stopping in perfect sync with my typing, a presence that reminded me how fragile solitude can be. Every time I left the apartment alone, I thought about that night, and every time I returned, I checked the window first. The story ended with a clear lesson. Awareness, preparation, and caution were the only defenses against the unknown people who might be watching, waiting. It was over, the danger passed, and yet the memory remained sharp, fully formed, a part of my life from that night onward. The echo of those footsteps never returned in reality, but in memory, it became a metric for vigilance, a personal marker of how quickly things can change, how real fear can exist entirely without exaggeration or imagination, grounded in the presence of another human being who didn't belong. It was over, fully resolved, and completely real. I arrived at the cabin just as the sun was beginning to lower over the trees. The road had been long and rough, a single lane of dirt and scattered gravel, winding through thick woods until it opened onto a small clearing where the cabin sat, modest and weathered, facing a lake barely wider than a pond. I had chosen it specifically for its isolation. I wanted to escape the city, the constant noise, the pressing sense of obligation, and spend a few days alone, fishing, and letting the air clear out the tightness in my chest. The lake was quiet, the surface smooth except for the occasional ripple where a fish broke through or a gentle breeze moved the water. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and wet earth, the way early September in Minnesota always smells after a day of sun and dry heat. I unpacked my gear slowly, setting rods and tackle neatly on the rough wooden table in the small cabin. The walls were thin, the floor creaking under any movement. The cabin smelled faintly of mildew and old wood, but it was clean enough, maintained just enough to give the impression someone used it regularly. There was a small stove in the corner, a stack of firewood, a sink with running water that tasted faintly metallic. I moved deliberately, aware that I would be alone here, responsible for everything: food, fire, security. The day had been long, the drive draining, and I wanted nothing more than to cast lines into the lake, feel the tug of fish, and watch the sun arc across the sky. The fishing was simple and methodical. I waded into the shallows, feet sinking slightly into soft mud beneath the water, rods resting against my shoulder as I observed the lake. Fish were cautious, nibbling at bait but reluctant to fully take it. I changed lures, moved along the small shoreline, scanning the treeline for any signs of movement. Birds called occasionally, and somewhere behind me, a woodpecker drummed rhythmically. The sun fell lower, turning the lake a molten gold, the reflection stretching thin across the surface, and I realized I had spent hours there without noticing. My stomach reminded me it was time to return to the cabin, where I could prepare a simple dinner and settle in for the night. As I walked back along the narrow trail, the shadows stretched long and the light dimmed in the trees. The forest had grown quiet. I felt the usual hush of the early evening, when animals retreat to their hidden places, and the wind seems more like a presence than a movement. I didn't notice anything unusual until I reached the edge of the lake. That's when I saw it, a shape moving across the water, swift and unnervingly large. At first, I thought it was a fish, or perhaps a fallen log drifting, but the way it cut through the water, the speed, and the height above the surface made no sense. It was twice as tall as me, a dark form gliding silently, leaving barely a ripple. I froze, watching it until it vanished behind the curve of the lake, telling myself it had to be a trick of the light, maybe a shadow cast by the trees, but something about it didn't feel natural. I shook it off, rationalizing that it was likely a large deer swimming across the far edge of the lake, or a piece of debris, and moved on. The cabin felt safer as I stepped inside, but the quiet was heavier, more pronounced now. I lit a lamp and set my fishing gear aside. The small stove hissed as I boiled water, the sound cutting through the silence in a way that almost startled me. I ate sparingly, the taste of canned beans and stale bread barely registering, more of a routine than pleasure. Outside, the light faded entirely, the lake darkening to a near black mirror. I could see the reflection of the cabin lights in the water, but nothing else. The forest seemed to press in closer. I noticed the first knocks on the wall soon after. They were soft, deliberate, measured, the sort of sound that could easily be mistaken for settling wood or wind through the trees. But there was a rhythm, a pattern, too intentional to ignore. I walked through the cabin, checking doors and windows. Nothing had moved, nothing seemed out of place. I told myself it was branches, wind, animals in the distance. Still, the knocks continued, coming in intervals that made me pause every time I moved, every time I tried to focus on something else. Then came the whispers. They were faint, carried through the walls in fragments, syllables I couldn't place. It sounded like language, words strung together, but nothing I recognized. I strained to listen, hoping for a sound that would make sense, but there was none. The whispers ebbed and flowed, following me from room to room. I kept my lamp close, feeling the light as a shield, my eyes scanning every corner. I moved slowly, checking the small windows, counting the locks on the door. Everything was intact. Everything was exactly as I had left it when I went fishing. Still, the presence of something deliberate, of movement just outside my perception, made the air feel heavier, tighter. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to steady my breath, trying to convince myself it was exhaustion, imagination, or stress. My hands shook slightly as I wrote in the journal I always kept during trips, hoping that putting words to the experience might contain it, make it manageable. I recorded the movement in the water, the knocks, the whispers. I noted how the light fell across the lake, how shadows stretched and retracted with the moonlight. I described the smell of the cabin, the temperature dropping rapidly as the night deepened. I wanted to record everything, to capture it before it became too strange, before I questioned my own senses. Then the ink smeared. I don't know if it was sweat or trembling hands, or if I pressed too hard while writing in low light. The journal ended abruptly, and I remember sitting there, staring at the window that looked toward the lake. My breath had slowed, my heart had found a rhythm, but there was no denying the feeling that someone, or something, had been watching, following, moving just out of sight. I stayed awake all night, the lamp burning low, the shadows in the corners of the room long and still. The cabin was silent at times, but the pauses themselves carried weight, as if anticipating sound, as if the forest itself held its breath. I didn't sleep. Morning came slowly, pale light filtering through the thin curtains, and I finally left the cabin, walking the trail back to the road, my fishing gear slung over my shoulder. The forest felt different in daylight, ordinary again, and I convinced myself everything had been imagined. Months later, the cabin was found empty. No one had lived there, and the doors were still locked from the inside. Large footprints were in the mud leading into the forest. I never saw who or what made them. The lake was calm, unremarkable, the forest quiet and solid in daylight. There was no sign of struggle, no trace of the person who had written in the journal, only the evidence of a single night spent alone, a journal with ink smeared, and the undeniable sense that the isolation, the water, and the forest had revealed something I was never meant to see. The journal remains, the entry a record of hours that began like any other escape to nature, and ended with a departure that left no answers, only the echo of deliberate movement in the dark. I arrived at the cabin just after noon, the sun still warm against my jacket as I carried my gear through the thick stand of pines. Northern Wisconsin in October is quiet in a way that sticks to your skin. The kind of silence that feels heavier than it should, like the forest itself is holding its breath. I had planned this hunting trip alone, needing the isolation more than the hunt. The cabin sat 100 yards off the dirt logging road, tucked into a clearing with a small pond to one side. It was the kind of place that looked abandoned in summer and untouched in winter, built from weathered logs, with a stone chimney that still held traces of smoke from previous occupants. I spent the afternoon setting up, making sure the generator was running, checking my supplies, arranging my firewood. The sun began to dip behind the trees, burning the leaves orange and gold. By the time I had hung my rifle on the wall rack, the shadows had lengthened and the first chill of night settled into my bones. The generator had hummed steadily all day, a constant reassurance, until it sputtered and died just as the sun disappeared completely behind the horizon. I tried restarting it, tapping the fuel line, checking the battery, but it was dead. There was nothing I could do but rely on the lanterns I had brought, and by the time I lit the first one, the woods outside were a uniform black. I had finished supper by the time I heard the first rustling. At first, I assumed it was deer. I had seen tracks near the cabin, and I expected animals to be moving now that the forest was fully dark. The sound was slow, deliberate, something heavy scraping through the leaves, and it didn't match the quick, light steps of deer. I froze, listening. The air was still too still. The usual background hum of insects and distant water was gone, as if the woods had stopped breathing for a moment. Then it started again, closer, heavier, dragging along the forest floor. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The beam cut a narrow line through the darkness, illuminating only the nearest trees. Nothing moved. Then just past the line I caught it, a shadow low and wide, moving in a way that didn't make sense. It wasn't crouching exactly, but it bent at odd angles, longer than a human arm should reach. It moved fast, faster than I expected for something that size, and then it stopped, freezing as if it had realized it was being watched. I flicked the light over it, and it vanished into the black. My heart raced. I told myself it was an elk or a bear, or even another hunter who had wandered too close. None of it felt right. I tried to ignore it, went back inside, and double-checked the locks. I had left one window cracked earlier to air the cabin out, and I closed it completely. I stacked another log onto the fire, and watched the flames cast shadows along the walls. Outside, the sound started again, soft at first, like careful steps brushing against dry leaves. Then it grew louder, deliberate, moving from one side of the clearing to the other. Every time I pointed the flashlight toward the noise, nothing was there. I circled the cabin once, flashlight in hand, but the forest seemed empty. Still, I knew something was moving out there. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the treetops, and I could hear branches snapping under weight. Heavy, irregular weight. The moon was thin behind a cloud, giving me only brief glimmers of the woods. I tried to remind myself that bears or large deer can sound bigger than they are at night. But then I saw them again. Two dark forms, low to the ground but impossibly tall, ducking between the trunks, disappearing before I could get a full look. They didn't behave like animals. Their movements were too precise, almost human, but wrong at the same time, too quick, too silent in the pauses. I returned to the fireplace and sat close to the fire, rifle in my lap, flashlight angled toward the nearest window. Every now and then, I would catch another glimpse, a shadow darting between trees, and I could feel my stomach tightening with fear. I thought about trying to sleep, telling myself that daylight would make everything normal again, but I couldn't. I tried to read my maps, marking hunting areas, but my eyes kept darting to the windows, following every sound outside. Every snap of a twig made me flinch. Every rustle in the leaves made me hold my breath. Hours passed. I moved around the cabin, checking locks, stacking more wood, keeping the fire alive. The forms kept appearing, always just at the edge of visibility, moving in ways that made no sense. Sometimes I would shine the flashlight directly on them, but they would vanish instantly, leaving only the sound of rustling leaves and snapping branches. At one point, I stepped onto the porch again, aiming the light down the small path to the road. The woods looked empty, but I felt watched, as if something massive was crouched just out of view waiting. By the time the first pale light of dawn touched the tops of the trees, I was exhausted. I hadn't slept, hadn't eaten since supper, and my hands were raw from gripping the rifle so tightly. I went outside, scanning the clearing with daylight now filtering through the branches, and I saw nothing. The forest was quiet, normal, the pond reflecting the morning sky. Tracks, too large for deer, wide and elongated, led into the tree line, but they ended abruptly where the shadows of trees were deepest. There was no other sign of the creatures that had kept me awake. I packed up my gear slowly, heart still hammering, aware of every sound, every flicker of movement. I left the cabin that morning, taking the long dirt road back to the main highway. The forest seemed normal in the daylight, the kind of place I could have driven past any other weekend and felt nothing unusual. I never went back. I told myself it was a combination of nerves, isolation, and imagination, but deep down I knew what I had seen, or at least glimpsed, was real. Something had been out there, larger than any person, moving in ways that were impossible. The memory of those silhouettes, the sound of their steps against the fallen leaves, and the way they seemed to vanish whenever I looked directly at them, has stayed with me. I haven't returned to that part of Wisconsin since. I tell people it was a bad night, that the forest can play tricks on the mind, but I know better. I know that what I saw wasn't a trick. The cabin is still out there, silent and empty, surrounded by those pines, waiting. And I know that if I had tried to sleep, if I had let my guard down even for a moment, I would have learned just how fast and quiet those things really were.